Hello, friends. Welcome to Fiscal Focus at DawnNews English. I'm your host, Danish Khan. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Nancy Folbre. She's Professor Emeritus of Economics at University of Massachusetts-Amherst. Professor Folbre is the author of numerous academic books and journal articles and is one of the leading thinkers on the intersection of gender and economics. Welcome to the show, Professor Nancy Folbre.
Oh, thank you. I'm like super excited to be here.
Yes. So in your recent book, you offer an intersectional political economy framework, right? And in the aftermath of the 2024 presidential election, I believe your book is a must read for anyone who's interested in making sense of what's happening in the US. So tell us, how does intersectional political economy framework help us make sense of the presidential election outcome?
Well, I think it gives us a richer picture of social division. It acknowledges that class is a really important dimension, but that there are other dimensions as well based on gender and race, ethnicity, and citizenship, and that none of these is necessarily inherently more salient than the other, but that conditions change that lead to shifting coalitions and shifting commitments to different allegiances to different groups. And I think that's a very apt description of what's happened in the election, where things really didn't turn as much on traditional, left versus right issues as they did on issues that are kind of hard to categorize in that traditional framework, like immigration.
So now, I mean, for our audience, what do you mean by intersectional political economy framework and how it is different than other economic approaches to make sense of the reality?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's not really my invention. It's a word intersectional that grew out of kind of critical race theory and feminism, trying to confront the importance of racial differences among women in the women's movement. But it's come to be very much aligned with stratification economics
Mhm.
as an approach that sees multiple forms of collective identity that not only often intersect, but are often kind of contradictory, so that a lot of people may find themselves in a position where they're advantaged in some respect by the status quo, but they're also disadvantaged in other ways. So they might be a working class wage earner, but be very identified as an American with a lot of the privileges of citizenship. Or they might be a woman who is very angry about reproductive rights being revoked, but at the same time is very concerned about the high rate of inflation. So it sort of nudges us away from a kind of simplistic analysis of where people's loyalties lie, and I think that's why it fits so well with what's been happening.
Yeah, and that makes sense. So you're suggesting that essentialism, whether it's in terms of class or gender or race, is problematic in many ways, not just at the level of analysis, but now we have seen in the realm of politics too. And it seems like, and especially in the mainstream discourse now, there's a lot of discussion how the Democratic Party, which historically or in the realm of the US mainstream represents left, right? Uh, Now, how should they reform? And on the one hand, there are folks who are arguing that it needs to pivot more towards center, right? Because, progressive politicians are unelectable. That's the discourse. Well, recently, Bernie Sanders released a statement arguing that the Democratic Party has abandoned working class. So, assuming he wants more pivot towards progressive economic policies. How do you see this debate and what's your take on it?
Well, I'm not so sure that center and left are such stable places on the political map. I mean, in some ways, I'm very sympathetic to Bernie Sanders' long run view of the Democratic Party, but I think it would be very difficult for the Democrats at this point in time to pivot in what he's calling a pro-working class position. Um, Also, I think his analysis is basically too class centric. Um, and in that respect, kind of out of date. It's not clear that candidates who represent more traditional working class positions, like Sherrod Brown, did not do very well in the recent election. And it's certainly not clear the Democrats may not be very pro-working class, but they're definitely more pro-working class than the Republicans. So that makes it hard to analyze the victory and their victory in those terms. I think it has a lot more to do with feelings about immigration and race and gender.
Yeah. So, and as you rightly mentioned, all these terms, left, right, and center, are relative to each other in the case of the every society, but also in the case of US society. So, in terms of you mentioning like these all social identities such as class, race, gender, immigration status, all of them mutually constitute outcomes, right? And also in terms of politics, all of these categories are important. So how we find a right balance, like, okay, do we specify at this moment class is important and at that moment or another moment gender or race are important?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think what's implied by the analysis is kind of a more complex, kind of almost game theoretic strategic environment where it's difficult to choose the optimal strategy until we know what strategy other groups are adopting, as it were. Um, but I think it means that we need to be a lot more attentive to coalition formation and to the discipline that's required to hold a coalition together. And I guess I would also add that I think it means that we need to um, think more carefully about what we mean by class, because one of the issues that's really emerged in a lot of the recent discussion has been the caricature of educated people as a professional managerial class
Mhm.
that um, is playing a really important role in kind of the pushback against the Democratic Party. And there's been for a long time some pretty creative thinking in left political economy about professionals and managers as kind of a swing class that could either be allied with employers or workers. But there hasn't been much consideration of how ordinary people might perceive professionals and managers as part of the enemy, because those are the people that are primarily the ones they come in contact with as kind of bosses who are managing their day-to-day life. And I think um, there has been a lot of convincing criticism of the Democratic Party as conveying an image of kind of know-it-all um, intellectuals that have kind of lost touch culturally with other wage earners, and I think that's something that we really need to think about as well.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, yeah, exactly. Especially the social conservatism in the U.S. tends to see even like middle class professionals and portray them as elites, while they might be in terms of the Marxian class sense, they're wage workers and may not necessarily have much power in terms of the economic realm. Now, moving on to your recent book titled The Rise and Decline of Patriarchal System and Intersectional Political Economy Approach, you critically evaluate first the conceptualization of value both in mainstream and heterodox traditions, including classical political economy. So tell us the significance of value, why it is such an important thing, and why should we consider um, reconceptualizing value?
In classical political economy, value was seen as something that was produced through exchange, and that kind of carried over into Marxian political economy, where surplus value is kind of produced through exchange value. And it led to a kind of disregard for both resources and forms of work that are taking place outside of the market. Now that we live in a world that's so marketized, where the market economy is so hegemonic, we've come to a greater appreciation of things outside of the market that are affecting its long run viability and sustainability. So I think we need to shift our attention away from the market and towards other forms of value. And that's what ecological economists are doing and what feminist economists are doing, is trying to think about how, trying to conceptualize a bigger picture of the economy and the value that it creates. I also think that while I'm not a great fan of neoclassical economics, I think that one really useful concept in traditional social welfare theory is the concept of public goods, goods that are not excludable in consumption and non-rival, and that therefore can't be produced efficiently by markets. And it's there, you can find it in any economics text, some discussion of it, particularly with respect to environmental problems, but it's always treated as kind of marginal, it's kind of the exception to the rule. And I think increasingly it's becoming apparent that actually public goods are much, much more important than private goods, because they're really vulnerable to depletion and misuse. So I think the whole concept of value from every direction really needs to be interrogated and revised. Yeah.
And building on this, so if we include non-market transaction, then the biggest realm is the family and the household production of non-market transactions. I mean, of course, there are some others as well. So then gender labor division of labor, and especially the social reproductive work, should encompass the creation of value, right? You're suggesting that. So how that would change our understanding of the economy if we take this approach?
Let me put it this way. Right now we see gross domestic product as the measure of our economic success. And gross domestic product is the final value of all the goods and services that are bought and sold in the market. Gross domestic product is just an input into things we care more about, like the quality of our lives, our health, our sustainability as a society, um, our ability to cooperate in solving public goods problems. So I think instead of, I think we can recognize the importance of the market economy and exchange value and GDP instead of seeing it as the end all and be all, the arbiter of success or failure. We should see it as an input into producing the things that we really care about. And I think kind of the ordinary person in the street says, well, duh, that's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
But it's an example of how professional and academic discourse has gotten so kind of remote from everyday realities that it's kind of fetishized this one big number as though it's the thing we should care about the most.
Yes, and it becomes more pressing issue because the policymakers, politicians are all fixated on gross domestic product
Yeah.
all around the world. So they will only think about solutions which also are help increase GDP. So that's why it's your work is very important. So how would you suggest that we incorporate these uh, invisibilized or otherized forms of labor within the accounting system, if it's possible?
Well, one thing we can do is we can um, look at ways of imputing the market value of some non-market activities, and that's already underway. We have satellite national income accounts, although they're kind of in their infancy. We have these satellite accounts that are imputing a value to environmental assets and to non-market work and so forth. But I think we need also to have a social accounting system that highlights the outcomes that we collectively care about the most. And maybe one example of that approach is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which are very qualitative in nature, but which can be quantified. Like, are we making progress towards these goals? Like improvements in life expectancy and reductions in poverty, et cetera, et cetera. So what that will require is real efforts to come to a consensus about what we want to have in our social accounts and how we're going to maintain those social accounts. And and we have to do more than just accounting. We need to think about what's the relationship between inputs of money and time and energy and the outputs that we really care about the most. So I think that's really a really ambitious agenda for social science. Like, what are the policies um, that we see that improve life expectancy or healthy life expectancy, which is probably a better measure? Or, what are the inputs that we're seeing that improve ability to collectively solve public goods problems, right? So um, what we need is some kind of accounting system that helps us understand some of the causal forces that are shaping the world that we're living in, which is in some ways, undergoing a lot of really kind of frightening stress and coming apart at the seams.
Now, in terms of understanding inequity, so as we discussed earlier, they're not just only class, but gendered and race inequalities in society. But in the mainstream discourse, or even among leftists, these discussions are usually framed in binaries, such as we can
Yeah.
understand gender inequities solely via patriarchy, or some would argue, the orthodox Marxian scholars may argue that it's capitalism and the capitalist social relations of production can explain everything. So, how do you see these discussions and how you conceptualize these broader social identities within capitalism?
Well, if you look at kind of the classical Marxian account of transitions between modes of production, it's basically one thing at a time. First there's primitive communism, then there's feudalism, then there's capitalism, then there's socialism. It's very formulaic, and it doesn't really concede the importance of differences based on gender or race or national um, allegiances. And I think instead we need to see forms of institutionalized inequality as kind of evolving and then overlapping and becoming very complicated hybrids. So um, I think we live in a society where we have big overlaps between traditional patriarchal institutions, especially cultural norms that are still very much in play, and kind of relatively new capitalist kind of institutions and norms, and also an overlay, especially in the United States, of institutions that really reinforced racial inequalities in very exploitative ways. One of the reasons hierarchical systems are so resilient is that they are so complex. If we only had one, if we were really only divided into two groups,
Mm,
if it was really just the 1% versus the 99%, the 1% would never have a chance. But the 99% is very divided and sees itself in competition with others in that group. And I think, that's why it's possible for global wealth concentration to proceed in the way that it has proceeded, those divisions. So um, somehow what we need to do is arrive at a better understanding of the co-evolution
mm,
of these systems of institutionalized inequality and exploitation, because sometimes they come into conflict with each other. They're not always mutually reinforcing. Often there are kind of tensions between
mm,
them, right? And I think, in fact, some of the tensions between traditional patriarchal systems and capitalist systems help explain why some groups of women have made really important gains over
mm.
time. So, a, just a better historical understanding of the co-evolution of hierarchies could help us forward, I think.
No, makes sense. So first, like acknowledge and recognize, and then incorporate
Yeah.
non-class or other hierarchies within class analysis would be, I mean, obvious even if you want to do serious Marxian analysis. But now, in terms of, I remember in your book you talk about this concept of manifold exploitation, right? So
Yeah.
tell us about that, and which is centered on this concept of bargaining power, again, where you draw from different strands of institutional economic thinking. So, yeah, how do you conceptualize exploitation in your opinion?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, let me just say that the impetus to that line of inquiry came from the tendency on the left to say class inequality is about exploitation. All other forms of inequality are about domination or oppression. They're non-economic. And I think that's a really false dichotomy. Um, and if that's the case, then how should you conceptualize exploitation? And I what I try to do in my book and elsewhere is to elaborate the concept of what is sometimes called cooperative conflict or coerced cooperation, which describes situations where people benefit from cooperating with each other, but the gains from cooperation are very unequally shared.
Mhm.
And that's an analysis that fits very well with the Marxian analysis of capitalism as a system that developed the forces of production and provided some benefits in terms of an improved standard of living for wage earners, but nonetheless distributed the gains from that cooperation very unevenly and very exploitatively. And I think you can apply that kind of same analysis to gender inequality. Women and men often really gain from cooperating with each other, and they cooperate to a very large extent, but they're often negotiating or bargaining over the distribution of the gains from that cooperation. And whenever I think people engage in collective action that enables their own group to claim a larger share of those gains, if they do that in a way that we might consider coercive or illegitimate, then I think we can call the results exploitation. So it's not as cut and dried as an analysis of who owns the means of production and who doesn't, but it's very much about, how are the institutions that are reinforcing inequality being enforced and who's benefiting from them. And I think that that gives us a way to think about the history and the impact of history and the path dependence of a lot of relationships of inequality on the global level.
Yeah, and I remember, I mean, because I use your framework to analyze particular political economy transactions in the context of Pakistan. And there you talk about unfair bargaining position within a transaction as exploitative. Now, thinking about bargaining position, what are some core things that mediate or determine bargaining positions? Can we specify them like in broad terms, or they have to be always empirically and they vary across time and space?
Yeah, I think it's provides a kind of conceptual framework for historical and empirical analysis. I mean, one thing that's pretty clear is that force and violence play a crucial role in bargaining power. And what we see today is that territorial conflict and conflict over access to resources remains a tremendously important vector of collective conflict. Um, and it's it's certainly affected by class differences, but it's not by any means reducible to class differences, right? So the power of the state to engage in predation, the strong nations ganging up on weak ones, that's a clear example of exploitation, I would say.
Mhm.
I think using the power of the state to establish coercive institutions or asymmetric property rights, that's another one. You know, when, you know, when 19th century policies gave the vote to white men and denied it to other groups, that's an example of exploitative bargaining power because it meant that people had no a large share of the population had no control over the public purse. So there are manifold
Mhm. Yeah.
exploitations. There are overlapping exploitations. And one of the, kind of visions of democracy is establishing more of a public accountability and a way of kind of addressing the persistence of those exploitative institutions.
Yeah, and earlier you mentioned public goods, and I teach a course where I talk to students in terms of conceptualizing equality of opportunity, right? And it seems like left, right, center, no matter what's your ideological inclination, everybody tends to, at least at the rhetorical level, agree that we want equality of opportunity in the economy, right? So whenever we talk about equality of outcomes, people get nervous, right? Especially in the US, but equality of opportunity, Senator Ryan, or former speaker from GOP, and President Obama all talk about equality of opportunity. But how we establish equality of opportunity, and I ask my students think about it, and in terms of public goods. So there, the provision of public goods become very central. So would you say, like in terms of ensuring uh, equal or fair bargaining position for all groups. At the minimum, we need a universal access to basic public goods would be a
Yeah,
starting point.
yeah, I absolutely would. And I would just add one thing that I think equality of opportunity is often defined for adults. Like,
Mm,
starting today, wherever you are,
mhm,
uh, if no one is discriminating against you, then you have equal opportunity. Well, that's a very shallow definition of equal opportunity because the capabilities that you bring
Hmm.
to that point in time are often very much determined by forces beyond your individual control. The country you were born in, the parents who took care of you, the access to that you had to health and education, and so forth and so on. So, in a way, you can't have equality of opportunity without some equality of outcomes in
Hmm.
the previous generation that allowed you to develop the capabilities to take advantage of the opportunities, right? So I think it's another example of a kind of false dichotomy that's, concealed some of the ways in which inequality is reproduced over time.
Because you're not just a scholar, but you are really tied to social movements or really care about them. So how do you see your work informing or interacting with activist movements today, particularly those who are interested in economic, racial, and gender justice?
I don't feel like I've been able to do as much as I would like or to accomplish what I care about the most in that realm, but I feel like I have made a real effort to do public education and promote economic literacy in a variety of ways. And that's an ongoing project. And it's become increasingly challenging over time because the media environment has become harder to access in a way. It's harder to find a voice in the great ocean of the internet. Um, but I still think it's a really vital and also really, a project from which we can learn a lot. It's not just a process of passing on information. It has to be kind of an interactive process of really thinking about what the issues facing activist groups are and how we can speak to those things.
Now, in terms of the policy making, um, what would be some key policy changes? I mean, if Professor Folbre has the policy under her control, what kind of changes would you like to see that would help us move towards more inclusive and just economy?
On a general level, I think if we could reduce the level of inequality, I was going to say on the national level, and I think that the question you asked is sort of implicitly pertains to the national level, but we should be thinking internationally as well. I think the really high levels of inequality that we are experiencing make it very difficult for us to cooperate and collaborate in problem solving.
Mhm.
And so I see that as kind of a necessary first step, not a final step, but a really important first step. And, a big part of that has to be really prioritizing meeting people's basic needs, thinking about higher minimum wage, a universal basic income, access to public services, redistribution of wealth and income in ways that potentially make us all better off, help us move towards a more sustainable system over time.
I really like your point about international dimension, and especially coming from the global south, we definitely see a lot of hierarchies, not just between countries, but also inequality within countries of the global south has increased a lot, and the bargaining power of working people there is definitely way worse than maybe the folks working people in the US. Finally, I would like your take, especially for young scholars who are interested in studying institutional or gendered or Marxian and overall intersectional political economy framework if they want to engage with them or study these topics. What advice would you give them?
Oh, what advice would I give? Oh, I don't know. I always tell my students to be curious, to look at things that other people haven't looked at, and to be willing to challenge orthodoxies wherever they appear. Be experimental, try new things, try to look at problems in new ways. I do feel like we're kind of at a pretty civilizational juncture where it's really easy to see how things could really become very apocalyptic unless we're able to figure out a way to tone down the level of global conflict and dysfunction.
Hmm.
Uh, the stakes seem really high, so I hope everybody I know is trying to solve that problem.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was wonderful talking with you. And thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Until next time, this is Danish Khan signing off from Fiscal Focus at Dawn News English.